to our department and to our Center for Social Research. He's a researcher at the Center for the Study of Democracy at Blaga University of Cluj, and will present us something about a very interesting project, Civimatics, and something else about a book project inside this larger project that, I don't know, our feedback will be welcome, as I understood. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrei. And just as a matter of clarification, in addition to having a couple of non-native speakers in the audience, both here and virtual audience like Ricardo, this presentation is also a formal requirement for the Erasmus Plus project. So because of that, you'd be useful, in addition to collecting signatures, to have the actual presentation for the evaluators or whatever. Okay, so what I will do is to start with a short presentation of the project itself, that is the Erasmus Plus project, for which this thing of mine is a part, the Romanian contribution, so to say. And then the bulk of the presentation will be stories about scientific research, and I will end up with some side projects that are related to this, but not formally part of it. So, if technology helps, which doesn't seem to. Arrow down, arrow up. Let's try enter.
Space, no.
The final frontier.
Maybe next slide. Oh, okay. So, that's actually what I just said. Those the three things with Tableau Companion and the Web Companion and the YouTube Companion will be related to the project itself, and I'll get back to this in a bit. Cinematics is maybe the name I was suggesting, is a project about the connection between civic education, scientific education, and democratic performance. The idea of the project is that if we enhance the two, if we make them better, then democracy will also work better. That's kind of my general understanding of the project. And back to my thing in this project, the stories about scientific research obviously does relate to scientific education, stories about scientific research, but the examples, some of them are from political/social science research, and some other examples would be from real science, this medical science, and even these examples on social research would be, I'm trying to pick examples that are relevant for important things. I don't know what our society's response to COVID was, which is partly about science, but also partly about what we do, what political elites do, what media does. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with economics. That's one book that I can think of my project would be kind of similar. One way in which it would be a bit different, in addition to being somewhat original, because in part of it is original, but most of the examples are from other people's research, and I will also have a bunch of examples that are, let's say, mine. It will also be just a bit more methodologically oriented. I don't know, think of multiple linear regression being the fanciest thing that would be in the book, so not that much advanced, but slightly more advanced than frequent to say. And that's kind of the public that I'm thinking of, the target group. And again, examples from all over the place. Okay, the three examples that ideally will become future chapters in the book. So the first one is mine. It's an example of electoral competition in Ukraine. The second example, which is not mine, and you might think, well, again, in just a few minutes. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, perhaps. Well, that was my initial reaction as well. What on earth would the introduction of electronic voting machine have to do with infant health? You'd be surprised, as I was. And the ghost map, yeah, I'll get back to my joke for my students related to the ghost map. I made it like probably 576 times already. Anyways, electoral competition in Ukraine. So, the idea being, if you look at regional level of support for a candidate, political party, in a given election, that would be a very good predictor of the level of support for the same candidate, same party in the following election. Yeah. And this is pretty universal, whether we're talking about the US, about Romania, about almost any country. Yeah. So, just a random example, well, kind of random. Not because I necessarily like Trump very much, but just because I look at him and who votes for him and so on and so forth extensively in recent years. So here see Trump votes in 2016 at state level as a predictor of his vote in 2020. Well, it's the two candidates share. In the US context, whether we look at other candidates, it's virtually the same. It doesn't change that much. And as you can see, it's an almost perfect correlation, 0.99. Yeah. Surprise. So, why is this relevant? This is just an example of how things typically are. Now, if we look at Ukraine, in the 1990s, and if we look at Leonid Kuchma's vote in the 1994 presidential runoff at oblast level, as a predictor of his votes 5 years later in the runoff, is a very strong correlation. As expected, it's just that it's negative, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. Yeah? And why on earth would that be the case? So it's negative 0.8. Now, if you're thinking of these two presidential elections in conventional left-right terms, things are not getting even more confusing, if you will. So, in 1994, Kuchma's opponent in the runoff was the incumbent president Leonid Kravchuk, who I would think pretty much all experts in Ukrainian politics would say, yeah, Kuchma was center right, or left-right turns. Kravchuk was on the left. In 1999, his opponent was the leader of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Pyotr Simonenko, which, well, I guess we can all imagine where his location of left-right turns was. So, okay, so the two elections look really similar, right? At least up until now. However, if instead of thinking of politics as one-dimensional, we think of it as two-dimensional, and we consider the second dimension, the Ukrainian nationalists versus Russian-speaking Russophiles, things look very, very different. Kravchuk, the incumbent president in 1994, was a Ukrainian nationalist. Right? Simonenko was the leader of a party whose goal was to make they put Russian on an equal status with Ukrainian language. Right? So from this perspective, Kravchuk and Simonenko were polar opposites. So what happened from one election to another, even though Kuchma was essentially in the same position, his relative position changed, right? So in 1994, he was seen as, the guy who would call, I was going to say, Putin, Yeltsin at the time, every 5 minutes. Then again, in 1999, when he was facing Simonenko, suddenly he started to look as a much better alternative for Ukrainian nationalists. Kind of think of Iliescu in 1992, 1996 versus 2000. Yeah? And what the Hungarian voters would think of him in the two contexts. It's pretty much what happened here and what would explain what we've seen before. Okay, so that's here, that would be kind of my original contribution. Okay, back to the electronic voting machines and infant health. Now, if your reaction to this would be, well, we're not sure, but you're smoking, or the author of that paper was smoking. I kind of had the same thing. I'm not sure what that was, but I want some. And then I started reading the actual paper and I said, oh, this actually makes perfect sense. So, bear with me. Maybe you'll think the same in like 10 minutes from now. The name of the author is Thomas Ujibara. He was a PhD candidate in economics in some Canadian university, and it wasn't Toronto or McGill, wasn't one of the famous ones. And yet, after doing stuff like this, now he's an associate professor at Princeton. Small wonder. Okay, so a few contextual things to say, which most of them you're already familiar with, maybe not that much with the electoral system, unless you're a big fan of electoral systems. So, as we all know, Brazil is very large, very unequal, both horizontally, geographical terms, among regions, cities, and vertically among social groups. Has a very high illiteracy rate. And if you have a very complicated electoral system, you see in a second what I'm talking about in more detail. That really raises major challenges for the electorate. And the consequence was that pretty much every election you have up to 30% invalid ballots, and not just in, some remote and obscure places in Brazil, pretty much all across Brazil. You'll see this over and over again. So, essentially, that's the next one. Yeah. This is how ballot would look like in Brazil. And in order to vote, you have either to write down the name of the candidate of your choice, or to write 4 or 5 digits number corresponding to that candidate. So yeah, if you're illiterate, that's not as easy as it sounds, right? And here's how an electronic interface for voting looks like. If you don't think of this intuitively as an improvement, at the first glance may not look like, but you can look this up. All major studies of when you give mobile phones to illiterate people anywhere in the third world, you see dramatic effects, and it's actually quite intuitive. So basically, this number is not up there yet, so it's blank. You don't see anything. You type in this example, 5-digit number, and then once you type in, this would show up the picture of the candidates, the name of the candidate, the party, which I guess this is the Labour Party. Yes. Okay, if that was the candidate of your choice, then you press the green button and you're done. If not, you press the red button, which actually is orange, anyways, and you start the process over again. What were the consequences? Well, the consequences were quite dramatic. And, I forgot to mention, this was a wonderful natural experiment, not by, kind of by design, but that wasn't the purpose to have a natural experiment. The introduction of electronic voting machine was gradual, right? So on the vertical axis, you see a percentage of valid ballots. So 1994, which is the last election where they used paper ballots all across Brazil, you see that 30% or even more of the votes all across Brazil were invalid. Then, that would be like in an actual experiment, 1994 election would be the pre-test, right? Then we have the treatment. The treatment would be the introduction of electronic voting machines that happened in 1998, but only in places that had more than 40,000 registered voters. In those places, and only those places, you see a dramatic decrease. Well, since we're talking about valid ballots, that means whatever is left up to 1 will be invalid ballots. So the percentage of invalid ballots decreased dramatically. It stays comparatively at the same level in places with where they didn't have electronic voting machines. And finally, in 2002, where all Brazil used electronic voting machines, you see that the percentage of invalid votes was dropped significantly everywhere. Now, I'll make the rest of the story short, so that I won't speak about Brazil for the next hour or so. Don't worry, I will speak for another hour period. I'll end up, this would be, the rest of it will be just quickly what happened so that we get to infant health. So, in places where you have electronic voting machines, in addition to the effective enfranchisement of lower socioeconomic status voters, obviously those would be those who would have a problem casting a ballot in the old system, you'd see that left-wing parties would start make significant gains, progress. This, in turn, would be translated into policies. More specifically, among other things, increased spending for healthcare. Now, even this to me was brilliant, Ujibara, to think about. Well, where would you see immediate effects? You know, look at education, maybe you'll see an effect in a generation. Even healthcare, well, maybe you see, I don't know, increased life expectancy in 20 years from now. One place where you might see immediate effects was right here. Yeah. That's lower socioeconomic status with future mothers would make a significantly increased use of the health system. And that in turn translated into significant decreased incidence of low wage birth, right? And that's, as the whole medical literature tells us, that's very important for it can affect, for better or worse, your health for the remainder of your life. So that's how we get from electronic voting machines to infant health. And finally, I'm getting to my favorite joke, for my students would be, the good news is that today we will talk about Jon Snow. The bad news is that we're not talking about this Jon Snow. Well, actually, the bad news for them. The good news for him is that we're talking about an even cooler historical character, not only because he was real, but because he's one of the most important persons in the history of medicine. Yes. That's Dr. Jon Snow, with John with an H. And what did he do? The ghost map is kind of a nickname of a famous map. Many say that's the second most famous map in history. The most famous map is a map of Napoleon's retreat from Russia. Well, actually, no, just the retreat, the whole campaign, because that's what makes it cool. But anyways, you will see the second map, not Napoleon's map. Okay, so the ghost map is a story about the 1854 outbreak of cholera in London. At the time, in mid-19th century, there were two competing theories. Well, even saying competing theories, it's a bit of an overstatement because pretty much all the medical establishment was a fan of the miasma theory. There's something in the air that makes you sick of cholera. Right? And Jon Snow was an outlier, said, no, there's something in the water. Cholera is not airborne. Unfortunately, he could only bring tons of very persuasive yet indirect evidence because the microscope was not yet invented, so he couldn't actually show what he assumed was there, and it really was. So, Dr. Jon Snow, yeah, it's our character, and Reverend Henry Whitehead was a reference in Soho who held his, kind of anthropological medical work. And we get to the famous Broad Street water pump and the ghost map. So what you see here is one version of the famous ghost map. Okay, since the light is a bit too strong, I don't know if you can see very well. There's some blue flags on the house. Well, let's see. All the blue flags are water pumps. And you really cannot see it. So you have to take my word for that. If you cannot see it, here's the Broad Street water pump. And these, the red things, are that and that. So the higher the bar, the more bats you have. And it's kind of the saying of the interocular chromatic test. When like the evidence hits you between the eyes. Look at the and say, there seems to be something funny about that water pump. Is the next, yeah. The next map is the same, it's just that it has yet an additional piece of information. So what John Snow did, among other cool things, was kind of do a detective work, not only identifying each and every death, but even the sequencing. And the first death, so here's the water pump, the water strip, the Broad Street water pump, sorry. That's the water pump, and here was the first death on that occasion. That was a newborn girl who became ill, and her parents threw the diapers in the sewage, which was next to the pump. And to put it mildly, sewage was not very high quality in mid-19th century London. Well, I guess it wasn't that good quality anywhere. One interesting, well, actually, yeah, let me get to that in a few minutes because it's probably more relevant over there. So this is one of the really cool things that he did. Really like it, kind of detective work, identifying this. The other thing, a cool detail is, where is it? There's like a block over here where you have no deaths, and that's because over there you had the brewery. And first off, they had a different source of water, and they were brewing beer rather than drinking water. So, which is kind of funny, but it's also consistent with the whole theory. Yeah, they say, well, it's not any water is contaminated water. Now, what you see here is Lambeth, Southport, and Vauxhall were two water providers in London. So in London, you have a few major companies providing water. And here we'll have yet another really cool experiment, yes? So there are places, neighborhoods, regions of London, where only Southport and Vauxhall provided water. This area, where Lambeth. And here, you had an overlap. And the overlap, it was really random. Kind of imagine, some of us, half of us here being on Orange, and the other half being on using Vodafone. And there's no difference in the previous cholera outbreak, but there is a major difference in the 1854. What's changed between the previous outbreak in late 1840s and 1854? Glad you asked. Or even if you didn't ask, I will still answer the question. What happened was that the Lambeth waterworks changed the source of water. They used to take water from the river Thames inside London. And that was a problem. Why was that a problem? Because given that the predominant theory was that cholera was airborne, what they would do was to improve the quality of air, take everything, including human waste, and dump it into Thames, which obviously did not improve things, only made things significantly worse. Now, after, in between 1849 and the 1853-54 cholera outbreak, Lambeth moved his intake from inside London to upstream, which meant that their customers would get water that was significantly better. And unfortunately, I couldn't, for the life of me, find data for 1849. I could only find zillion references, all the authors agreeing that the death rate was very similar for the two companies. So you'll have to take not my word for that, their word. So I've only found data for the 1854 outbreak, where we see that here's death, there are 10,000 houses, where Lambeth's death rate was lower by an order of magnitude compared to the other company. So here we have yet another cool natural experiment. So even though the setting, the things we're looking at is very different, if you think about it, the logic is exactly the same as in the previous example. Yeah? We have like a natural experiment, we have a pretest, and then we have a treatment. Yeah? And we see dramatic results. Okay. So, that's in a nutshell kind of the general idea. I'll only take a few more minutes to tell you a few words about some related projects, but closely related. So, Tableau Companion, if you're not familiar with Tableau is a freeware. You can download it for free, and you can make really cool maps, graphs, and so whatever I will have in the book, for whoever is interested, I'll say, okay, here's the Tableau Companion, here are the data sets, and here's how you can replicate them, if you want to. And, okay. This looks very similar to the map we've seen before. Now, if you're looking more closely, you might notice some weird things, like, well, I don't know how well you can see it. What was that? Yeah. Here's Sony Entertainment. That's because that's a student of mine. I'm collaborating with him on the Tableau public part. He's the expert, not me. So we had a data set, but couldn't find a map from mid-19th century London, so he used a contemporary map. So, but if we find one, then it will be the exact same map. But other than that, it's the same map. Yeah. The blue dots are the water pumps, and the red dots are number of deaths. And I'll just show you one example, if technology lets me to show it to you. Oh, sorry. I have to switch the screen, because otherwise we have no idea what I'm talking about. Unless I'm giving you a new share screen. Share screen. What I'm doing? New share. No. Anyone has a suggestion how to switch the screen over there as well?
Stop sharing, share again.
Okay. Share screen. And hopefully. No?
Da. Nu mai bine închis și pui din nou.
Says your screen sharing. I have no idea. Nothing. Well, okay. It would have been cool. I was able to show you. It's what you are supposed to see. So you have to take my word. That is a locality level map of the vaccination rates in Romania. And when I first looked at maps like this, I thought this would probably take like 6 months or a year to figure out how to do this. Actually, if you have the steps, like I had, it takes like 10 or 15 minutes as a literal. So the only thing that you need is Tableau Public, a really good data set, a decent laptop or computer, and it takes like 15 minutes to make a map like that one.
Nu încerci să oprești de tot prezentarea și să pui din nou? Trebuie să poți face. Da. De pe ghință. Sau cu full screen.
Maybe would have a suggestion how to show it. Well, anyways, you can see it in the.
No, I didn't. Yes, the Windows sheet.
No. Good. Never mind. Okay. That's nothing more. Okay. And no, I cannot see anything.
O să micșorez.
If you go with no, I cannot. No. If you have it in front of you when you go with the mouse, then you can make it bigger or smaller, and you can place your mouse on a locality and you see which locality is and what the, not only that, but just thinking about pointing to a specific locality, and it will tell you that's locality X from county Y and the percentage of people fully vaccinated is Z. So, anyways, so okay, that was that. On that chaotic note, I'll thank you for your patience. I hope it was interesting and waiting for comments, suggestions, and complaints. Thank you.
Să te vadă și cei de pe Zoom. Măcar o dată.
Okay.
Măcar la final.
Eu stau pe Zoom în cravata.
Okay. Hello, Ricardo. Better late than never. Yeah.
Flori, just in brief, with regards to the vaccination rates in Romania, could you perhaps just tell us in brief what you found? In terms of the correlation between rates of vaccination and COVID, what did your map reveal?
I didn't look at that. The one thing I did look at was whether level of development had, for level of development, had a, somebody might be familiar with Dumitru Sandu's work. Okay, has an index. I didn't have the chance to find how he computed that in more detail. By looking at the ranking of localities, kind of made sense. I mean, not kind of. I'm not saying was anything wrong with it. Just like looking at over 3,000 localities in Romania. Like, yeah, well, that's pretty much where I expect this locality to be and that locality to be. That's what I'm saying. So he called that kind of, I think, probably kind of like human development adapted to Romania and locality level. That was a strong predictor. However, even when controlling for level of development, partisanship also, well, partisanship obviously at locality level, I didn't have. Don't worry, I don't have individual level data about how Romanian voted. Probably not even my former colleague Eddie Helvig has it, although you'll never know. Anyways, our was a strong predictor, and as you expect, in the negative direction. Vote for USR was also a strong predictor in the positive direction, and PSD-PNL was kind of, yeah.
And do levels of development correlate with population density?
Vaccinated, yeah, right. The more...
No, just general population density. Do levels of development, areas that are higher on your indices of development, do they correlate with population density?
I didn't look at that rate, if it does get your question. Only vaccination rate. So I don't have that.
But I know, yeah, it does.
I would think it would, but yeah.
It's not a question, but could you tell us more about the Civimatics project?
Sure. Well,
Because from the description from the website, it sounds very interesting, but...
well, I'm not exactly sure if this really answers your question. It's just what I can come up with, sort of a bit outside of the exact things I'm doing. So there's two, well, there's two German universities that we've seen, and of those, Paderborn and the Norwegian Institute of Technology, blah blah. They are doing mostly the math part, and then the Vienna people and the colleagues from Hanover are doing the civics thing, and I think that was originally the plan that they had in mind for me. It's just I already did it, not that well, but on previous projects, so to me that would have been a bit boring, so that's why I try to move to the real science, so to say. So, okay, so I'm not sure if that answers any of your question. It's kind of a division of labor. Some groups in the project do mostly the civics, the politics part, the other ones doing the scientific part, and I'm trying to do both. But, with more or less success. We'll see.
Yeah, Florian, I don't have a question about methodology, but it just strikes me that these are really powerful tools for political communication.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see anywhere in the world where political parties are beginning to employ them for purposes of political campaigns? And of course, you're somewhat of a student of politics in the United States. And I'm thinking about Ross Perot's 1992 run, in which he used charts, not maps. But it was remarkably effective in its way. When a third-party candidate who gets 19% of the vote, really just unseen before the past or since, those kinds of numbers for a third-party candidate, using this kind of simple visual tool to get support. Why aren't we seeing more of this in your estimation of political campaigns? Why aren't they making use of these kinds of tools?
The short answer would be, beats me.
Yeah.
Why don't you ask the politicians? I mean, why don't you do that? I mean, what, not
Have you approached them in Cluj, for instance, to see if they might be interested in?
Well, I might in a year or two. Hopefully, this will be more developed, and I can hand them both the book and the tableau companion. Here it is. It's not this, but unfortunately, what we're seeing, at least up to now, my impression is that those who are actually effective, and again, not using exactly this, but with communication, generally speaking, are exactly guys like Trump, like the Le Pen family in France, like Orban in Hungary, and so on and so forth. Which obviously, right, the related point would be, okay, so then you have something to use to counter that. Yeah.
Are you going to have a call for chapters in this book, or it's going to be your book alone?
Yeah, this will be single.
So, okay. Too bad.
Yeah, well, if it works out, it will be my first book, so hopefully I'll have a book of my own before I retire. So, yeah.
It's going to be published in Romanian?
That's an excellent point. The goal of the project is to have materials in Romanian. So, in a sense, it's not even a matter of personal preference, it's a requirement of the project. For my own good, obviously, I'm more interested in the English version, But both from the perspective of the project, as well as kind of, let's call it community service, yeah, the Romanian part be more useful, and well, there will be ideally we'll have English and Romanian versions for everything, like the books, even if it won't be, a translation, an actual book, but there will be at least the draft chapters, the Romanian versions available to anyone interested. I don't know, online or on a document or something. Same with the tableau public thing. Same with the YouTube tutorials on how to make maps and graphs and stuff like that. So everything should have eventually an English and a Romanian version. So.
And do you have a time frame for the publication?
Not really. Well, and again, yeah. If I can get a publishing house interested, then I will know a more specific answer to that. They'll be like, yeah, okay, fine, but when? And then I will get, oh, okay. So you need it in. Well, one version of this could be quite soon. So say if I Palgrave pivot or Springer briefs says, yeah, this is good for us, then if you have a manuscript for this series, it takes like 3 months rather than 2 or 3 years, like for a regular book. Yeah, should be, ideally should be really soon, even for my own good. So that I'll have additional something, so yeah. That's not a very specific answer, but it's the best I can come up with as of right now.
So the last slide relates to Jeff's question in the sense that you can provide some political guidance to Ukraine after the war.
Well,
to explain the previous voting preferences, or?
yeah, well, I'm afraid it's a bit too late for that, So, if I could travel back in time like 20 years ago to say, if you look at these maps and this, you know that you have a very serious problem here. Now, I think it's a bit late to fix electoral behavior in the 1990s. Well past. Yeah.
But on the serious side, the 1999 was this was one of the dimensions, the national identity and Russophile attitudes.
I would argue, and I doubt I'll be alone. I think those scholars who know Ukrainian politics way better than I do would say that was the most salient dimension in the last 30 years. In all major elections, that was the most important thing.
So not really left and right, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've talked about this before, Florian, but that's exactly what I saw. I did a book on Latvia's austerity policies, and that's what we saw exactly following the 2008 financial crisis, was that there was a huge debate over economic policy, whether or not the country should impose really, really just awful austerity policies. And everyone thought the election would be over that. Instead, it went completely along the lines of ethnicity. In 2 critical elections following the 2008 crisis.
Yeah. Now, the data, well, it's an old data, but still it's data from like 20 years ago when I started to, let's say that in one election, might have been even the 94 or 99 election, I can't recall the individual level data, survey data, so the correlation questions and wrote like poematic. You know whether the person was speaking Ukrainian or Russian, and it was almost a perfect predictor of their mood. So.
So your point was that in Latvia there was this debate again.
Yeah, I mean, it was just fascinating the degree to which ethnicity trumped all other considerations in terms of an election which even was fought on the terrain of economic and social policy. But regardless, it just broke right along the ethnicity line. Yeah, it was really quite remarkable, given the magnitude of the issues at stake at the time and the effects that it would have on people's everyday lives.
Okay, so if there are no other questions or comments, we could continue our conversation with Florian after the official time. Well, thank you, Florian, for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
And I think we can stop the Zoom.